Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Library, where Star Wars is in print, the Force is with the readers, and you can bust out your lightsabers, boys and girls, because we are debunking the myth of the Star Wars Dark Times in this episode. I'm your host, Nathan P. Butler. What we're looking at this time is the concept of the Star Wars Dark Times, or Dark Age, in publishing. We hear all the time about how before the EU came around, the expanded universe, the official continuity, it's all meant to fit together, in 1991, that Star Wars had gone silent, had gone dead. Fans still loved it, but for a long time there were no new Star Wars EU-style publications out there to enjoy, so Star Wars fans were left with nothing. It was the dark time, before the dark time, before Bantam and Dark Horse. Yeah, except see, here's the thing. They say that this is like this huge wasteland of time for Star Wars publishing that was only saved by West End Games' Star Wars role-playing game. And yes, there was a time when all that was around was a Star Wars role-playing game, and no, that's not an item that many people would have picked up if they were just comic or novel readers, so yes, it does make it an unusual thing for Star Wars to stay alive only in RPG form. But not for as long as people make it out to be. People make it out to be this huge amount of time that was so bereft of Star Wars, and that's just not the case. So, we're going to take a look at some of the actual stats, the actual time frames for this gap in publishing that people decry so much. Let's start with the one of these that actually has some validity, because it is a pretty big gap. That's Star Wars novels. The first Star Wars novel ever produced was this one. Star Wars from the Adventures of Luke Skywalker, a novel by George Lucas, which is actually an adaptation of A New Hope, released months beforehand in 1976, ghostwritten by Alan Dean Foster. We had this, we had novelizations for The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, we had Splinter the Mind's Eye, also by Alan Dean Foster, 3 Han Solo novels, and 3 Lando Calrissian novels, until we finally had reached the third and last Lando Calrissian novel, Lando Calrissian and the Star Cave of Thonbaka by L. Neil Smith, which was released in 1983. So from 76 to 83, we had Star Wars novels, and then that's it. That is the last Star Wars novel until the publication of Heir to the Empire by Timothy Zahn, the first of the Thrawn trilogy from Bantam Publishing in 1991. That is an 8-year gap, and that is a long period of time in the history of Star Wars to go without any new Star Wars novels. Dark Times, folks, I'll give you that one. Oft forgotten, but still somewhat fitting the Dark Times angle, I suppose, is Star Wars comic strips. You know, like in newspapers and whatnot. Star Wars comic strips began back in 1979 for the LA Times newspaper syndicate, ended in 1984, and then have not reappeared as newspaper strips since. Although there were, in 2004, the launch of web strips on StarWars.com's hyperspace area. They took some of the old newspaper ones and represented them online. They had new ones like the evasive action stuff, like Reversal of Fortune and whatnot. Even one based on a Hunter's Fate, Greedo's Tale, that's totally blown out of the water now thanks to the Clone Wars cartoon series and such. But that is a pretty big gap, right? 1984, the end of Williamson and Goodwin's run on the newspaper strips, and 2004, with web strips, that's 20 years. But that's not usually what people are talking about when they talk about the Dark Times. They're talking about novels and comics and general Star Wars storytelling, usually forgetting the newspaper strips for the most part. And hey, let's stick with the ones that give a little bit of validity to this Dark Times idea before the broader concept is just blown out of the water or blown up like, well, Alderaan. What, too soon? How about Star Wars cartoons, right? The first Star Wars cartoon we got was that little bit with Boba Fett in the holiday special that George Lucas wants to forget ever happened. The whole holiday special, not necessarily just the cartoon, by Nelvana Limited. They then picked up later on in 1985 and 86 with Droids and Ewoks, right? That is, Droids and Ewoks both getting a first season in 85, and then Droids getting a special in 86, a feature-length special, and then Ewoks just winding up basically getting a second season, a very heavily revamped second season. But what does this give us? Well, there wasn't another Star Wars cartoon on television until 2003 with the Clone Wars micro-series by Genndy Tartakovsky. So, if we're talking Star Wars cartoons, we have a 17-year gap, 1986 to 2003. What about animated feature-length presentations, or at least sort of longer presentations than a regular standard cartoon episode? Well, we had the Great Heap in 1986, the end of droids. We still haven't seen one of those. We got the Clone Wars film, which is a Star Wars animated feature, but not on television. That's a 22-year gap, 1986 to 2008. And if you want to talk about ones on television, we're told that Disney Channel will run a feature-length beginning, a pilot episode, in a sense, a pilot movie for Star Wars Rebels in 2014. So that's even longer. Tack 6 more years onto that. And if we're talking actual feature length as opposed to just longer than a regular episode type stories, Great Heap doesn't count. We gotta go back and check out Ewoks The Battle for Endor in 1985, the second of the 2 Ewok films, which means we go from 1985 to 2014 before we wind up getting another telemovie style presentation of Star Wars. But if those are all relatively valid, those are big gaps worth of time, then why do I say the Dark Times thing is mostly rubbish, as our friends across the pond might say? It's because of comics. Star Wars comics were produced starting in 1977 by Marvel Comics with Star Wars #1, the first part of a 6-part adaptation of A New Hope, covered right here on From the Star Wars Library, just like all the other Marvel stuff. Okay? This led to 107 total issues of the regular series, 3 annuals, and a 4-issue Return of the Jedi adaptation, along with oddball things like Marvel Illustrated Books Star Wars 1 and 2 that reprinted UK stuff, stuff from Marvel's Pizzazz, and what have you. So is the end of the Marvel series? Marvel issue 107, is that the end of Star Wars comic publishing in 1986? No. No, it's not. Because by this time, they were going with Star Comics, the imprint of Marvel, for Droids and Ewoks comics. Okay, fine. Droids and Ewoks. Droids ended before Ewoks, so what about Ewoks? This is the final issue of Ewoks. Ewoks number 14. But is this one the one that was the end of Star Wars comic publishing? Well, yeah. In 1987, for Marvel, it was. But not Star Wars comic publishing in general. Just for Marvel Comics. After this, we had a 3-issue series of Star Wars 3D from Blackthorn Publishing that lasted into 1988. Its last issue is this. Star Wars 3D, number 3, in mid-1988. And this is the last official Star Wars comic published prior to 1991's launch of Dark Empire with Dark Empire number 1 from Dark Horse Comics. 1998 to 1991. That's 3 years. That's your dark time? That's your huge stretch in which only the RPG was out there and Star Wars was dying. That's your dark times? I call bantha poodoo on that one. 3 years for Star Wars is nothing, and here's why. How long was it between the release of A New Hope in theaters in 1977 and the release of The Empire Strikes Back in theaters in 1980? 3 years. How about between The Empire Strikes Back in 1980 and Return of the Jedi in 1983? Oh crap. 3 years again. Now granted, it was 14 years then from the time that Lucas put out Return of the Jedi and the time that Lucas put out the special edition trilogy for the 20th anniversary of A New Hope. So that, we could fix that thing where Han doesn't shoot first anymore because he always planned on Han not shooting first. That's why it was like that in the first film. Oh, maybe not. But if we're talking about Star Wars films, yeah, there's a huge gap. 16 years between the release of Return of the Jedi and The Phantom Menace in 1999. But there was other stuff being produced in between because the EU launches in 91. And Star Wars didn't end with Jedi in 83. It ended, if you want to leave out the RPG, with Star Wars 3D number 3 in 1988. Well, what about those films in theaters? Well, the same pattern is back again, and it even extends beyond the prequels. What do we have? Episode 1 in 1999. When is Episode 2? 2002. 3 years. Episode 2, 2002. What about Episode 3? That's 2005. Again, 3 years. And to top it off, Revenge of the Sith to the theatrical film release of the Clone Wars animated film that kicked off that series in 2008, 3 years. If you're a Star Wars fan, and you were decrying the idea that 3 years is just too long to go without new Star Wars materials of the kind that you prefer, then you should be whining in the gaps between the films. Okay, that does not a dark time make. At least not in my opinion. So when we talk about the dark times, we need to recognize that it's not really this huge thing that people make it out to be. It's a 3-year gap in which, yes, West End Games should get credit for keeping Star Wars alive with no new comics, no novels, no television specials, anything until the EU launches in '91. But this was not a huge time gap, and it's certainly no more than what we see in the wait between Star Wars films within trilogies or within eras in the case of the prequels and the Clone Wars film. We all just need to step back and relax. Star Wars has never gone away, and it probably won't for a very long time to come, unless Disney completely ruins the saga or something. So, chill out. Our dark times for us are over. The interludes are done. The supplements are done. Next time around, we start taking a look at the 90s with Heir to the Empire. Thank you for watching, and may the Force be with the readers.